I wasn't supposed to meet her that day. I had only come to visit an old college friend in his hometown, a quiet place with narrow streets lined with maple trees that had already begun turning amber. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, and everything felt slower than the restless city I'd left behind. When I arrived, my friend was running late, so his aunt, his widowed aunt, welcomed me instead. She opened the door with a kind of graceful composure that caught me off guard. Her dark hair, brushed neatly behind her shoulders, carried a single streak of silver that seemed less like age and more like a mark of dignity. She smiled politely, the kind of smile meant for strangers, not for closeness, and yet it warmed me. "You must be Daniel," she said, her voice calm but touched with something soft, like music that lingers after the last note. Inside, she moved with a quiet confidence, setting down a tray of tea with steady hands. I couldn't help noticing how she carried herself, not hurried, not forced, just natural, as though she'd lived 1,000 evenings like this, making space for others even when no one had asked her to. Still, there was something in her eyes. A heaviness that flickered when she thought no one was watching. It wasn't the kind of sadness that makes someone weak, but the kind that sits in silence, woven into the rhythm of daily life. I'd never met someone who could look both so strong and so fragile in the same moment. I sat across from her, trying not to stare, though I was certain I failed. The china cup she placed before me trembled just slightly in her hand before she pulled it back. Perhaps she noticed my hesitation, or perhaps she was measuring me, this young man, sitting awkwardly in her living room, filling the quiet her late husband used to fill. For a while, the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the mantel and the faint clink of her spoon against porcelain as she stirred her tea. But eventually, conversation found its way between us. She asked about my work, my family, the usual small talk. I answered simply, but in her gaze I felt as if she was listening for something deeper, as though weighing the honesty behind my words. There was no reason for my heart to beat faster, yet it did. Perhaps it was the way the afternoon sun touched her face through the window, softening her features. Or maybe it was the way she spoke with that quiet authority, making me want to lean in just to catch every word. I hadn't expected to feel anything that day. But when she looked at me, really looked, as if searching for something she wasn't ready to admit, I felt the first pull of something I couldn't quite name. Something that would not let me go. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. But in that quiet town, paths had a way of crossing without warning. The next morning, I stepped out into the garden just as the mist was lifting. The grass was damp under my shoes, and the air was cool enough to raise goosebumps along my arms. She was already there, kneeling among the roses, her hands wrapped in thin gloves, brushing soil gently away from the roots. She looked up at me with surprise, as if caught in a secret. Then, with the faintest smile, she said, "I didn't think anyone else would be awake this early." I told her I had always been restless in the mornings, unable to sit still when the world felt new. She chuckled softly, the sound warmer than the sunlight breaking through the clouds. "Restless," she repeated, as though the word reminded her of something she used to know. That morning, we spoke of simple things, how the roses had bloomed late this year, how the town's small library still smelled of old paper and dust, how coffee never tasted the same when you made it just for yourself. Yet beneath those small details was something else. A thread pulling us closer without either of us meaning it to. Later that week, it happened again. I found her on the porch one evening, wrapped in a light shawl, watching the last streaks of sunset fade into night. I hesitated before joining her, but she shifted slightly, making space beside her. The boards creaked under my weight as I sat, and for a long moment we just listened to the crickets in the distance. She asked me about my work, about the city, about why I had chosen a path so far from home. I answered, but as I spoke, I realized I wanted her to know more than the surface. I wanted her to understand the loneliness of chasing ambition, the way crowds could still leave you feeling invisible. And when I told her this, she didn't look away. She just nodded, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the porch light. Then she told me about her late husband, not in a heavy way, but as if recalling a chapter she had already read too many times. "He was a good man," she said, her voice steady. "We built a life together. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, I wonder if I'm supposed to keep building, or just sit with the silence." Her honesty struck me. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how gently she carried them. She wasn't asking for pity. She was simply opening a window into her heart, letting me see a place most people would pass by without noticing. And as I listened, I realized something had shifted. She was no longer just my friend's aunt, no longer just a kind host. She was someone whose presence lingered with me long after our words had ended. Someone who made the air feel different when she entered a room. It was subtle. It was quiet. But it was the beginning of something I knew I couldn't ignore. It's strange how the smallest things leave the deepest mark. Not the big conversations or the obvious moments, but the ones no one else would notice, like the brush of a hand, the silence between words, the way two people stand just a little too close without realizing it. One afternoon, she asked if I could help carry groceries in from the car. It was nothing, really, just a few paper bags filled with bread, fruit, and a carton of milk. But when she handed me one of the bags, our fingers touched. Lightly at first. Then, for an instant too long, neither of us pulled away. Her skin was warm, softer than I expected. The weight of the basket shifted awkwardly in my hands, but all I could feel was the echo of her touch, burning quietly against my palm. She blinked, almost as if she, too, had felt something, and then looked away, giving me the smallest polite smile. That evening, I found myself on the porch again. The sun had gone down, and the night carried the smell of jasmine from the garden below. The swing creaked gently as she lowered herself beside me. She sat close enough that our shoulders brushed, just barely, just enough for me to feel the fabric of her shawl against my sleeve. I froze for a moment, unsure if I should shift away to give her space. But before I could, she leaned back into the swing, completely at ease, as though my presence there was natural. My chest tightened with something I couldn't name. We didn't talk much. Just small remarks about the stars, about how the town seemed quieter at night. But I kept stealing glances at her profile, the delicate slope of her jaw, the way the porch light traced a soft glow across her hair. Every time she turned her head, I quickly looked away, afraid she might catch me. At one point, the breeze grew cooler, and she drew her shawl tighter across her shoulders. Instinctively, I wanted to reach out, to hold it in place for her, but I kept my hands folded in my lap. That restraint, that quiet ache of wanting to move closer but not daring to, it was almost unbearable. Still, There were moments when her eyes lingered on me just a second too long, moments when her lips parted as if to say something but then closed again. And in those pauses, I felt it, that unspoken pull neither of us had put into words. The world around us was ordinary. Just a porch, a swing, a summer night. Yet inside me, something was shifting. The distance between us wasn't measured in inches anymore. It was measured in hesitation, in unspoken longing, in the trembling awareness of how much I wanted to reach across the space and hold her hand. And though nothing happened that night, no words, no bold gestures, I went to bed knowing something had begun. Something fragile, but real. The rain came suddenly that evening. One moment, the air was heavy and still, the next, thunder rolled low across the hills and the sky opened. Sheets of water blurred the view outside, streaking down the windows until the whole world looked like it was trembling. I found her in the sitting room, near the largest window. She was curled into the corner of a chair, her shawl draped around her shoulders, a half-empty cup of tea resting on the table beside her. The dim light from a single lamp fell across her face, catching the lines of tiredness she rarely let show. I hesitated at the doorway, not wanting to intrude. But when she turned and met my eyes, she gave me a small, almost weary smile. "The rain always makes me think too much," she murmured. I stepped inside, drawn more by her tone than her words, and took the seat across from her. For a while, neither of us spoke. The storm outside filled the silence for us, the pounding of rain on the roof, the occasional crack of lightning, the steady rhythm that made the room feel at once safe and exposed. Finally, she sighed and set her cup aside. "I don't know why I let myself enjoy this," she said quietly. I frowned, unsure what she meant. "Enjoy what?" Her eyes lifted to mine, hesitant but unflinching. "Your company. These evenings. The way you listen." She paused, and I could see her swallow hard, as though fighting herself. "You're young, Daniel. You have your whole life ahead of you. And here I am, still figuring out how to live mine without him." Her words were soft, but they struck like a confession. I could feel the weight behind them, the guilt, the hesitation, the ache she carried for letting someone new into a place that once belonged to her husband. I leaned forward, my voice low. "I don't think there's anything wrong with enjoying someone's company." She gave a faint laugh, almost bitter, and shook her head. "It isn't that simple. You're young, but that's exactly my weakness." The words hung in the air, fragile and electric. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. It wasn't a declaration of love, not even close. But it was the closest she had come to admitting she felt what I felt, that same pull, that same fear. I wanted to reach for her hand, to close the distance that seemed to grow and shrink with every breath. But I didn't. I just let the moment linger, the storm outside raging while inside we sat with something even more dangerous, truth. Her eyes glistened with something unspoken, and she quickly turned back to the window, as if afraid she had already revealed too much. And I sat there, my heart pounding, knowing that from this moment forward, nothing between us could ever be the same. The rain began just after dusk. At first, it was only a whisper against the leaves, then a steady drumming that blurred the world beyond the windows. The lamps inside the house glowed with a golden softness, but everything outside was a blur of gray and water. I found her by the tall window in the sitting room. She hadn't turned on the overhead lights, only a single lamp on the far side of the room. Its warm glow brushed her cheek and caught on the silver strands in her hair. She was sitting with her knees tucked to one side, a shawl gathered close, her eyes fixed on the storm as though it carried the answers to questions she couldn't say aloud. I almost turned back. She looked so deep in thought, so untouchably far away. But something in her posture, her shoulders drawn just slightly inward, her hand clutching the edge of the shawl too tightly, pulled me toward her. "Do you mind if I sit?" I asked quietly. She turned, startled but not annoyed, and gave a faint smile. "Of course. The rain's better when you don't listen alone." I sat across from her, though part of me wanted to close the space and sit nearer. The storm filled the silence between us, the patter on the roof, the occasional roll of thunder, the dripping gutters outside. It was the kind of sound that made you feel safe and exposed at the same time. She let the silence stretch, her gaze still turned outward, then finally she spoke. "Rain always makes me feel unsettled. Maybe because it forces you to stop. And when I stop, I remember." Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, though she tried to smooth it over with a small laugh. I didn't press her. I only listened. After a long pause, she shifted, her eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I don't know why I let myself enjoy this," she whispered. My brow furrowed. "Enjoy what?" Her lips pressed together, then parted again. "You. Your company. These conversations." Her fingers tightened around the fabric at her shoulder. "It feels selfish." "Selfish?" I echoed, leaning forward slightly. She nodded. Her eyes were glassy, reflecting the stormlight. "You're young, Daniel. You carry possibility like it's stitched into your skin. And me, I'm still trying to make peace with the life I've already lived, with the silence that follows me now. I shouldn't need this, but I do." Her voice lowered, trembling as though the words themselves carried too much weight. "You're young, but that's exactly my weakness." The room seemed to still, even as the storm outside raged harder. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a declaration, not even a request, it was a confession she hadn't meant to let slip. I wanted to take her hand, to tell her she wasn't alone in this. But I stayed still, every muscle taut with restraint, afraid the wrong movement might shatter the fragile honesty she had just offered. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before she looked away, back to the rain, as though hiding from what she had already revealed. And I sat there, my pulse echoing the rhythm of the storm, knowing nothing between us could remain the same. After that night in the storm, something changed. She didn't say it outright, but I could feel the distance growing. Where once she lingered in conversation, she now kept her words brief. Where she used to sit beside me on the porch swing, she began choosing the far chair instead. Small shifts, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to me, they were unmistakable. She was retreating. And yet, every time I told myself to accept it, I would catch her gaze when she thought I wasn't looking. Once, while I was helping in the garden, I looked up and saw her at the kitchen window. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, her hand resting on the sill, her eyes fixed on me. The moment she realized I had noticed, she turned away too quickly, as though embarrassed to be caught. That silent contradiction, her body pulling back, her eyes pulling forward, was almost unbearable. One evening, we crossed paths in the hallway. It was late, and the house was quiet except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock. As we passed, my hand brushed against hers. Instinctively, I reached as though to take it, to hold her there in that fragile sliver of closeness. But she pulled away gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's better this way." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. Better for who? For her. For me. For the world outside that might never understand what existed between us. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail, the warmth of her hand for that split second, the way her eyes had softened even as her body stepped back. My chest ached with the kind of longing that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, it just sits heavy, pressing against every breath. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was only infatuation. That I was young, that I would move on, that she was right to keep me at a distance. But each time I saw her, her hair pulled back in the morning light, the sound of her quiet laughter when something amused her, the way she brushed her fingers over the petals of her late husband's roses, I knew I was lying to myself. This wasn't passing fancy. It was something deeper, rooted in the way she carried both strength and sorrow, in the way her presence steadied me even when words weren't spoken. And I began to realize, the pain of her pulling away was proof of how much she already meant to me. Still, I respected her distance. I didn't press. I didn't chase. I let her set the space between us, even if it tore at me. Because beneath it all, I hoped, quietly, desperately, that her withdrawal wasn't rejection. It was fear. Fear that what she felt was real, too. It was in the garden that everything shifted. The roses had always been hers, planted years ago with her late husband, tended with care season after season. I'd seen her there countless times, pruning, watering, brushing her fingers lightly over each bloom as if it were alive in more ways than one. But that evening, she didn't look like a woman tending to her flowers. She looked like someone trying to hold herself together. Her hands trembled as she worked the soil. The gloves she usually wore lay discarded on the stone bench, and dirt streaked her palms. I stood at the edge of the path for a moment, watching her shoulders rise and fall with unsteady breaths. Something in the sight of her, the strength she always carried, cracked open by the weight of memory, made my chest tighten. I stepped closer, the gravel crunching softly under my shoes. She didn't turn. "Do you need help?" I asked gently. Her voice was quiet, barely reaching me over the breeze. "No. I don't know why I still do this." He loved these roses. And sometimes I think I keep them alive for him. But other times, her words trailed off, her hand faltering in the soil. Other times I wonder if I'm just keeping myself trapped. Before I could think, I knelt beside her. My knees pressed into the damp earth, and without asking, I reached for her hands. Her skin was cool, smeared with dirt, but I didn't care. I covered her trembling fingers with my own, steadying them. She stiffened at first, startled by the sudden closeness. Then, slowly, she let out a long breath and didn't pull away. The garden was silent except for the rustle of leaves in the evening wind. My thumbs brushed gently over her knuckles, wiping away traces of soil. Her hands, small against mine, began to still. She looked at me then, not with guarded politeness, not with avoidance, but with something raw. Something she had been holding back for too long. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, she leaned just slightly, enough that the space between us seemed to collapse, though we hadn't moved more than an inch. The faint scent of roses drifted between us, mingling with the warmth of her breath. I didn't speak either. I didn't dare. All I did was hold her hands, feeling the fragile steadiness returning to her, the way her fingers slowly curled against mine as though testing if it was safe. It wasn't passion that surged between us in that moment. It was relief. Relief that she didn't have to stand alone in her grief. Relief that I wasn't imagining this pull, that she felt it too. For the first time, she let me be her anchor. And for the first time, I felt her choose to stay in my touch rather than withdraw. In the stillness of the garden, surrounded by roses planted for another man, she let herself rest against me. And I knew, without a single word spoken, that something fragile had finally given way to something real. The night after the garden, the air felt different. The storm had passed, the earth smelled of rain and roses, and the town below glowed with the soft flicker of lanterns and porch lights. It was the kind of evening that invited stillness, when even the crickets seemed to sing more slowly. I found her on the porch, seated on the swing where we had shared so many hesitant silences before. She didn't look startled when I stepped outside. Instead, she lifted her eyes, her expression quiet but open, as though she had been expecting me all along. I sat beside her. This time, I didn't keep a careful distance. The boards creaked softly under our weight, and the swing swayed once, then steadied. She shifted just slightly, enough that her shoulder brushed against mine. A simple movement, but it carried more meaning than any words she could have spoken. For a long while, we just watched the lights of the town. The lanterns swayed in the night breeze, their reflections trembling in the puddles along the street. She exhaled slowly, her breath brushing against my arm, and then she leaned into me. Her head came to rest against my shoulder, light but certain. I felt the warmth of her cheek through the fabric of my shirt, the steady rhythm of her breathing against my chest. Without thinking, I lifted my arm and wrapped it gently around her, my hand resting on the curve of her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She only settled deeper, as though she had finally given herself permission to stay. The world seemed to narrow to just that moment, the quiet hum of the night, the scent of rain-soaked wood, the weight of her leaning into me. After a while, she spoke, her voice low, almost uncertain. I don't know what the future holds for me. I don't know if I even have the right to feel this way again. She paused, her fingers curling lightly against my sleeve. Then, softer still, but I do know this feels alive. I tightened my hold on her, just enough to let her know she wasn't alone. I'm not afraid of what others might think, I said quietly. I just want to be here. With you. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her face slightly toward me, her temple pressing gently against my jaw. The gesture was so tender, so deliberate, that it silenced any need for more words. We sat that way until the lanterns in the distance began to dim and the night deepened. No grand declarations, no hurried promises, only the unspoken understanding that we had chosen to stay beside each other, whatever might come. And in that stillness, with her warmth pressed against me and her hand resting lightly over mine, I knew the truth. I hadn't just found comfort in her presence. I had found something rare, something fragile, something worth protecting. Something real.